I'd like to call the meeting to order with the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We have all but one member of the board in attendance. Matt Stock will not be with us this evening. Before we move forward, do I have any announcements? I don't see it on here, but we should formally approve the agenda as well. Could I get a motion to approve the agenda for this night, this evening? Motion, Don, second, Dennis?
Yeah.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, carried. We have one item under board development this evening. That relates to a follow-up from the discussion that was had at the December, I believe it was, public session relative to possibly moving forward with reviewing the capital facility needs for the district. And the board has discussed reconvening the facilities committee that was last brought together in 2013, 2014. So with that, I guess, barring any discussion, I would entertain a motion from the board to authorize the district to reconvene the facilities committee with the task of reviewing the scope to consider for an upcoming capital project, the timing and so forth, with preliminary report out to the board later or in early summer before the end of the school year. So moved.
Second.
All those in favor? Aye. Aye. Carried. All right. Dr. Hicks.
Thank you, Mr.
Superintendent's report.
Fuchs. We'll go quickly. Two things for tonight's budget presentation: the governor's budget and a review of the first draft of the Clarence budget. We'll start with the governor's budget. This is a rundown of the governor's executive proposal, which starts the budget process. Later on in February, early March, each house of the legislature will come out with a one-house budget. Then there will be negotiations prior to the actual adopted budget. Foundation aid is the biggest piece. For Clarence, we didn't receive a bunch of foundation aid. A little bit of a summary. The foundation aid is based on a brand new formula created by the governor, which includes combined wealth ratio, free and reduced lunch, and sparsity. The governor's proposal is less than what the regents asked for, considerably less, about $1.3 billion less than what the regents asked for. All districts were assured of at least a quarter of 1% increase to a maximum of about 9%. Our increase in Clarence was a quarter of 1%. That equals about $8 per kid. The state remains $3.7 billion behind phasing in the foundation aid formula, and there's probably no hope that there will be big movement made on that this particular year. A couple of other things in the governor's budget. The governor did fund all the expense-driven aids according to the formulas. That's good for us. Our transportation, special education, and other expense-driven aids did increase. The governor does, however, want to consolidate 11 major expense-driven aids into a new category called services aid that would grow annually based on inflation and changes in district enrollment. I would be opposed to this. I think it's a bad idea. We really don't get expense-driven aid until a year after we expend it. This is kind of a proposal that we should probably reject. The governor also proposes creating a new tier of building aid for projects approved after July 1st, 2019. If this did take place, it would probably lower our ratio for the proposed project, which at this point is 67%. This is also a bad idea that we would advocate against. In the governor's budget, there's $157 million in a stabilization fund that can be used by the legislature to increase portions of the budget, mostly foundation aid. So the prediction is by the time we finally finish the budget, foundation aid will be at least up $150 million. Some other things in the governor's proposal, some of which are on the verge of already happening or have already happened legislatively. The tax cap, making it permanent, that's been voted through. The millionaire's tax extending, and there are some proposed STAR changes. STAR is a benefit to everyone who owns a home. The governor proposes capping STAR exemptions at 0% and allowing STAR income credits to grow by 2%. The exemptions are what people normally think of when they think of STAR. It reduces the taxable assessed value. Capping it at 0 would be a change, a pretty big change. Changing from just exemptions to credits, where you would get a check from the governor in the mail, usually the preceding November after you vote, that essentially would make that law. It would also reduce the income eligibility for STAR from $500,000 to $250,000, and that may impact some members of our community. A couple of other things in the governor's budget summary. Decoupling state assessments from teacher and principal evaluations. So APPR has already been voted on and approved by the Senate and the Assembly, and it's sitting on the governor's desk right now for approval. It would authorize students to bring complaints against public schools pursuant to the human rights law. This is another big, that was a debate today, that also passed. It would make General Election Day a state holiday. We don't vote in our schools, so that really might not impact us, but if it was a holiday, we'd have to plan for it in our calendar. It would authorize stop arm cameras on school buses and speed zone cameras near schools, and allow schools to pursue fines against people who violate the law with school buses. Establish limits on e-cigarettes, and allow school staff to seek orders of against someone who would be a danger to themselves or others, including students. Some things that we'll advocate for when we get a chance to see our legislators. An update of the an update and a complete phase-in of the foundation aid formula is the big deal. It's $3.5 billion behind. That's something that we really need to advocate for. We would advocate for amending the tax cap to always be 2% as the start point, rather than the CPI. For the past 2 years, it's been a 2% start point. It is this year. We'd advocate for more mandate relief, starting small and thinking big. We'd also advocate for more flexibility with our reserve funds. We do oppose, at least the administration opposes, consolidating expense-driven aids and changes to building aid. So that's the governor's budget. Our budget. Two big things that we've been working with for the past 8 years. Protect and enhance the core programs of the district, and exhibit fiscal responsibility with people's tax dollars. This is our process. We start really in late November, early December. Rick and I meet with all the administrators and supervisors. We do everything else on this list, lending itself up to the community vote. We have these special budget study sessions, and we videotape them and make them available for our community. On the expense side, here's what we're anticipating. A 3% increase in wages, pretty much across the board. 4% increase in health insurance costs under our self-funded system, which is better than the community rated. A 5% increase in workers' comp costs, 2% in special ed, 5% in BOCES, 1% on everything else in the district, and a decrease in teacher retirement system costs that we're anticipating to be about $480,000. It may end up being a little bit less than that. It may end up being a little bit more than that. But in the first draft of the budget, in order to make things work, this is what we built in. So that's the stuff on the expense side. Our debt service is now stabilized and won't have an impact on the levy. On the revenue side, there's 3 big drivers of revenue in Erie County for budgets: property taxes, school aid, and sales tax. The property tax, really, the cap constrains how much we can raise locally. We've kept within the cap for every year of its existence, and in some years we've been below the cap, and we'll show a chart on that coming up. School aid is also capped. It's tied to a growth in personal income, although the governor has, over the years, extended that particular cap. Clarence really is more dependent on state aid now than it has been ever, and our state aid increase is relatively small. Some more assumptions on the revenue side. As it stands right now, and it will be finalized on March 1st, but as it stands right now, our best estimate of the tax levy cap is 3.2%. At 3.2%, it will generate about $1.6 million of revenue. We need about $2.4 million in revenue to roll the budget over from one year to the next. So all the other revenues are going to have to increase by about $890,000. That would include a 2% increase in sales tax that we build in. And Rick, that's conservative and probably will occur, correct? We're going to increase our appropriated fund balance by $550,000 and start spending down our debt reserve from the last project. This is a risky thing. We just need to make sure we keep our eye on it and not allow this number to get too high. We thought our aid would increase by about 3%, but when you take into account expense-driven aids and foundation aid, it only increased about 1%. So that left us a little short. Here are the last 11 years of spending and tax levy for Clarence. And over the 11 years, we've averaged a little over 2% on spending increases and a little under 2% on tax levy increases. So we have been either at the cap or below the cap every year since 2012-13 when the cap existed. Three big factors that make up the cap number. The state growth factor, which cannot go any higher than 2%, but is at 2% this year. Our local tax growth factor of new builds within the district is, when you adjust it, about 1.2%. Debt from previously approved debt service, we really don't have anything on there this year. So at 3.2% at the cap, we think that's a pretty solid number. Could go up slightly or down slightly, but not much from where it is right there. So what's that mean for the average taxpayer? Well, we always do three different looks: $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 home. It's about $30 on every $100,000 of assessed value. So you can see in the chart, for a $200,000 house, which is about the average in Clarence, it's a $62 increase annually. The rate we're anticipating would be $13.98 per thousand, under $14 for the first time in, well, besides last year, for the first time in over 25 years. So our tax rate is excellent based on the assessed value and the number of new builds in Clarence. So that's a little bit about the revenue side and a little bit about the expense side. And this is the time when we also talk about program. So our goals in the budget from a program perspective are no reductions in staff and either maintaining or improving all of our existing programs. The capped levy alone doesn't allow us to do all of that. The governor's budget doesn't give us enough state aid to do all of that. So to balance things, we have to count on some increases in state aid, which we hope will come true by April 1st, and some use of reserves in order to fund a rollover budget. Some things that we brag about in terms of our kids and the performance of our kids, which makes a good bang for the buck in Clarence. These are some things from the class of 2018. Here's some additional program requirements for music, advanced placement, athletics, extracurriculars, full slate of programs. Some business first stuff. We're third overall in cost effectiveness, 13th in per pupil spending across the entire upstate, 6th in administrative efficiency, 3rd lowest spending per pupil, 4th highest teacher experience, even after our retirements, and the 2nd lowest full value tax rate in Western New York. Really, only the city of Buffalo is lower. Some academic stuff, third highest academic ranking, 1 in science, 2 in math, 10 in social studies, 4 in English, first in athletics, and our per pupil spending is almost 30% lower than the statewide average. Here's a chart of our kids' performance compared to the rest of Erie County and New York State. And you can see that the green numbers are substantially better than Erie County and New York State. And that's what people's taxpayer dollars pay for. Here's some fiscal comparisons. Our per pupil general ed expenditures are less than $10,000 per student. Schools that are like us are $14,000 per student, and all schools across New York State are $12,000 per student. When you put it all together, our total expenditures per pupil are lower for special ed, lower for general ed than similar schools or the entire state. Some more quick review of the assumptions. Our cap level will be 3.2%. What is that? It's about $30 on a $100,000 home, $60 on a $200,000 home, $90 on a $300,000 home. We think our wages, by the time we're finished with all our contract negotiations, are going to go up about 3%. Healthcare at 4%, and that might be a little high. Special ed and health services increased by 2%. Everything else up by 1%. Our pension costs will decrease, and that will help us close the gap in our budget. We'll use state aid, miscellaneous revenues, and reserves to stay within the tax cap for 1920. If we get substantially more state aid, the board can decide what you would like to do with it. And at our retreat this past weekend, we gave you kind of a wish list of things, and you can have that in the back of your mind if we get lucky and get some type of major state aid increase. The other thing to consider with a major state aid increase would be to spend down the increase in the appropriated fund balance from where it is now at $550,000 to maybe half of that. We're also recommending we continue with our bus purchase plan. So every year we cap it off with a simple slide that talks about how our budget compares to this year. So this year, $83.1 million, about $1.5 million in new revenue under the tax cap, $890,000 in other revenues. So next year's budget, $85.5 million. Buses, we're on our 10 to 12 year replacement cycle. We have about 100 buses, so 10 buses per year to change out keeps us in a good position in terms of the vehicles. 5 big transit monster buses, 2 of them, or 2 additional ones that have compartments so we can haul music and athletic equipment all over the place. 2 30-passenger wheelchair buses. We figure we'll get about 22 grand on the trade-ins, so we would bond it out at $934,000, and this really would have no impact on the levy because we've been doing this for at least 5 years in a row. These are our dates. Our next study session is February 25th. Traditionally, at the February 25th study session, we will talk to you about enrollment. We have all of our enrollment projections. We have our class size projections for next year. We'll put all of that in. If anything happens legislatively between the New York State and executive budget, we'll throw that stuff in. We'll also put in our 5-year plans in terms of expenses and revenues and answer any questions that the board might have. In between January, the February, and the March special budget sessions, there are our regular meetings as well where the community can ask questions. So if you don't mind, Board of Ed, I can open it up to the community members and see if we have any questions.
Anyone in attendance have any budget-related comments, questions? Any board board member have any comments or questions relative to the budget presentation?
Just 2 weeks ago when the governor's budget address came out, and the next day in the newspaper you see Clarence has a 5.2% increase.
Right.
Maybe you could explain that. Because that's,
Right. So I'm going to let my esteemed colleague Rick Mancuso explain that one.
Sure, the state aid are estimates all the time. The $25 or so million the governor is estimating we will get this year is just that, an estimate. So they're basing the increase on an estimate of what we're going to get this year. Our current budget this year only has a couple $100,000 less than what he's estimating next year's to be. So the 5% is misleading as far as budget to budget. It is not accurate. And again, they are making estimates on expense-driven aids and things like that that we are in the process of expending and getting aid on.
and then our foundation aid went up 0.25%, which was.
It only went up $35,000, which is really the one you look at to see, are we getting what type of increase?
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Just two questions on, so we talked about the upcoming meetings. For the March meeting, we will have our tax cap locked in because that's March
Yep.
1st, correct?
Yes.
We'll also have the TRS number locked in.
That's what I was going to ask. So it's for
Right.
the March meeting, we'll know the
Yeah.
TRS for certain.
We might even have the TRS number by the February meeting. Sometimes they put it out in the second or third week of February.
And I guess the last question I had, or maybe just to have a further comment just for characterization for anybody that might be watching the video later. So the tax cap, again, it's a complicated thing. When we certainly deal with the town growth factor as a piece of that and how it relates to an individual's home. So the 3.2% is what the tax levy goes up. But given the growth factor, can you just talk about how that might impact someone's
Sure.
individual taxes?
And certainly, in broad strokes, which is the easiest way to explain it, like you just mentioned, because the tax cap is on various layers of the tax levy. But basically, if the levy goes up 3.2% on an estimate, and we have at least 1% growth in the town, then any individual's tax burden would only go up a little over 2%. And that's what we're estimating, just over 2% on an individual's home.
So the chart which talked about the tax cost of $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 home, that's reflective of roughly a little
Slightly
over
over
2%.
Yes.
Thank you.
That number could be lower.
Could be. It has been historically.
Has been historically. You really won't know until the August meeting when you establish the rate, but we've done well there. So every year, our estimates of what the actual dollar-to-dollar figure would be end up being lower than what it really is come next year. We'll also have that chart in the next, in the February meeting.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Any community questions? Okay, that concludes the budget report. Mr.
Thank you,
President.
Dr. Hicks. All right, so we do have a public comment session. We do have someone here who would like to speak to us. David Lowry, who's Executive Director of Erie County Association of School Boards.
Thank you. I just started with the executive director position November 13th. We are now working with a shared leadership model. I serve as the executive director on the point 8 position, and then the point 4 position is Dr. Joe O'Malley. She is actually president of the Kenton School District. I have served on the Erie School Board. I started in 1987, and I've been on the Erie BOCES board for 9 years. So we have a great deal of depth as far as the leadership and
Thank you very much. Any other public comments? Seeing none, I would entertain a motion to adjourn to executive session for the purpose of discussing the employment history of a particular person and to discuss collective bargaining with the Clarence Administrators Association. Motion, do I have a second? Second. All those in favor? Aye. You're adjourned. Thank you, everybody.